thank you all for joining us this morning, this afternoon. We're looking forward to chatting today. So just again, to reintroduce ourselves, again, I'm Kelsey Nelson. I'm on the product marketing team at Okta, and I support our overall security solutions as well as our education and public sector customers.
And I'm Michele Decker. I'm the manager of our identity and access management services here at the University of Notre Dame.
Right. And Michele, thank you again for joining us today. We're looking forward to chatting more about the work that you guys are doing. To give everyone a quick overview of what we're planning on talking through today, we'll start off with just some general background and trends that we're seeing in the higher education IT space. And then really where we wanted to center today's webinar talk was on the work that Michele's team is doing at Notre Dame to modernize their IT and also some lessons learned from some initiatives over the last few months. And again, as Margot mentioned, we do have some time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to pop in questions into that Q&A box on your screen, and we'll make sure to answer as many as we can after we wrap up the lessons learned and advice section. So just to jump right in, we'll again start with some background. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Okta, Okta's mission is to enable any organization to use any technology. We, for many higher education institutions, serve as that connective tissue between people and the services that they need for their campus. So I've included a few examples on here that are hopefully ones that are resonant with folks here on the call today. We also, when we think about identity, we think about it in a couple of different buckets. So one, we think about this in terms of a platform for connecting, again, that core user base of staff, professors, potentially those contractors that come into your organization, and partner collaborators. But also a secondary piece is extending that to be able to use this. We refer to it as customer identity, but for higher education institutions, that's really focused on students and the alumni populations. And for all of this, we wrap all of our identity work with this approach to modern zero trust security. So, and when we say zero trust, I know that can bring to mind some questions about, it's probably a buzzword you've seen at different conferences or around security publications, but really what we mean by this is as higher education institutions are adopting more cloud and mobile technologies, the way that we approach security needs to shift. That previous perimeter-oriented approach to security doesn't make sense in this new paradigm. And so how can we rethink how we're approaching security in light of this shift? And for many organizations that we talk to, that first step or that foundation for this more modern zero trust type approach to security begins with identity. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this presentation. I did want to also share some insights that we've seen from the higher education landscape. So we ran a survey earlier this year to hear from higher education IT leaders what their biggest priorities were for the next year. I think it's probably less surprising to folks who are joining us today, but security is overwhelmingly the #1 priority. But then as we get further down, we also see challenges around transitioning to cloud technologies and being able to reduce overall IT costs, as well as the ability to improve the user experience both for our student users as well as the engagements that we have with our alumni. And Michele, I know you and I had chatted ahead of this to get sort of your take. Does this resonate with the priorities within Notre Dame?
Absolutely. We've invested tremendously in building our reputation and status across the country and around the world, and security is a high priority for us to be able to protect that reputation, as well as we are caregivers of a lot of personal identifiable information for students and faculty as well as our employees, and we don't like to make the headlines in that way.
Yes, no one wants to be in the headlines for that. And I know, too, we're going to spend a lot of today's conversation kind of as well talking about those second two areas and how you guys are looking at your transition to the cloud and what that means in terms of optimizing efficiencies for your IT team as well. So with that, kind of the three buckets and how we're framing today's conversation will be around those core challenges. So one, how do we start to build the foundation for a modern IT system? We know that campus IT has a very unique challenge in terms of the complexity of the user base as well as all of the applications that need to be accessed from the students to staff members. So how do you start to consolidate all of that in a modern approach? Second, as Michele mentioned, being able to enhance school security is top of mind. Again, no one wants to be in the headlines for that reason. And then third, how do we do all of this with the resource constraints? I think every IT department could use a broader budget, but how do we optimize efficiency for the tools that we do have? So that's what we'll center today on. Before we jump into those specific buckets, though, I'm sure many folks on this call are familiar with Notre Dame, but Michele, do you want to give a little background on the university and what your team does?
Sure. So the university was founded in 1842. We are a private research university inspired by our Catholic character to be a powerful force for good in the world. And just to give you an idea of what our constituency is like, we have over 12,000 students, about 8,000 undergrads, and the rest are graduate and research students. And then we have about 6,000 full-time faculty and staff, and then a whole host of other faculty and staff that support all the services that we provide for research and scholarship.
Great. And your team specifically oversees the identity and access management solution, correct?
Correct. And just to give you an idea of where we were and where we moved to with Okta, we have 3 primary categories of services that we support. The account lifecycle, we have what we call the account generation process that produced a single network identifier that we call the NetID. It's a conglomeration of shell scripts, Perl scripts, Python scripts, some PowerShell sprinkled in, and a little bit of C# every once in a while, with web services infrastructure that supported a lot of our provisioning processes to target systems. And then we had our main authentication system for our single sign-on authentication was backed by CAS and SHIB, CAS being Central Authentication Service, and Shibboleth. And then we had MFA prior to Okta that was integrated with our single sign-on service. And so, but it was the whole process. SHIB relied on CAS, CAS relied on the directory servers, and the directory servers then deferred authentication to Active Directory ultimately. And then the backbone of all of our systems was our enterprise directory service, which was comprised of many flavors of directory services and many replicas to support all of these functions. And then we also supported Radius for networking devices to authenticate VPN concentrators and wireless authentication.
It sounds like you had your hands full.
Yes, and then tying it all together, we had a suite of apps that we had to support and maintain that would, for our users and helped us to manage identity.
And that sounds like extremely complex for your team to manage, and then I'm sure also managing access to new applications, and you guys were looking at adopting additional cloud services as well?
Yeah, so the trend has been that departments come to us with all these applications, these software as a service applications, and they're told they don't need IT, but they do need to log in. So we were integrating probably about 100 services a year in the last couple of years.
Wow. So I think that then ties to this first one. So when you guys started to think about modernizing and consolidating across all of that infrastructure, again, one thing that we hear from many organizations is it's the challenge of that back-end infrastructure and also being able to manage access across this very complicated user base, right? A student could also be functioning as maybe an employee if they are a work study member, or a staff member could be auditing a course. and that, again, layering on all of those different services that each department may want to roll out. So how did you start to think about modernizing those systems? You also, and maybe you could give a little, you talked about the homegrown system a bit, but how did you start to approach that?
So yes, the challenge in higher ed is having all these roles, and often users assume multiple roles, and when they transition those roles, how do you make sure you're provisioning access in a timely fashion and then also revoking it? That's always a challenge, as well as, so our approach in our IAM systems was always, we were just tacking on each time we had a new service, new system to source data from, new requirements on the back end of what data was needed to be provided to this new service. And so it just became a sprawling infrastructure. And so we also had a lack of visibility across the systems, with so many systems spread out over all these different services. The logs and all the activity is spread out amongst a lot of these services, and so it's hard to zero in on to trace a user's activity when you have to combine and consolidate log information from all these different disparate systems.
Absolutely. And so when you were starting to think about a new identity system, what was your approach? Can you talk a little bit through the journey of how you started to shift into sort of a cloud identity solution?
So we, as a university, decided to take the approach of a cloud-first approach in our IT. So it helped to have that underlying strategy, which is to look for a software as a service solution first, then platform, then infrastructure as a service, and then as a last resort, some custom built. So that was our mantra going into this, and so we started evaluating products to see how we could improve our service delivery time, as well as to make it more efficient in getting users access to systems. I mean, over time, all this years of conglomeration of IAM services, and they would run in serial. So at some points in time, it could take multiple days to actually provision services, fully provision an account. Mm-hmm. So we needed to reduce that time. We needed to be able to focus in on the business of identity and access management and less about supporting the infrastructure. So that's when we did an assessment and started looking for a cloud provider to see what they could do for us.
Definitely. And so you mentioned you were looking for something that would help provide more visibility. Were there any other key criteria for you as you were starting to go down that path?
Well, as I said before, so that activity is spread out amongst many different systems, so it was hard to get a consolidated view of an individual's activity when they were accessing systems, when we would have to do audits for information security. Also, we had some visibility as a service owner. You could see who had access to your particular service, but resource managers really didn't have visibility across, my employee, what did they have access to? And the timeliness of the offboarding was always an issue as well.
Yes. And I think, so you mentioned the timeliness and the visibility and also the benefit for your team, and you brought up the security component as well, which is, again, something we talked about earlier, but the need to provide that visibility into who is accessing what across your entire ecosystem. One thing that we hear often from or when we take a look at the security landscape for higher education, is it's one of the most targeted from a phishing standpoint industries, right? And so we start to see that phishing. I think the stat that we pulled from the Verizon Data Breach Investigation report around compromised credentials being the leading cause of today's breaches. 1 in 10 education users are still clicking on that phishing link. And so how can we start to look at ways to enhance our security, both from a visibility standpoint, but also knowing that our end users, our students, and our staff within universities tend to be targeted with this type of attack. How can we start to rethink or put better controls, security controls around these users? And I know there's actually, this is more on the K-12 side, but I think it kind of speaks to the broader education landscape, is that we are seeing this trend around these types of attacks coming after these users. And even there was a Forbes article, I think, last week just on this. So it's definitely top of mind across the industry. And Michele, I know it's something that we had spent some time talking about before. How do you guys, you mentioned you'd used MFA previously. What's that like for your campus?
So we definitely, our help desk and our information security office are still, they send out regularly notices of the latest phishing scam. And Notre Dame is a big target. And but the phishing attempts are getting more sophisticated as well. They can really mimic messages that look like they come from our help desk or our information security office. So that was our initial approach, was we need to introduce MFA. And when we did it, we branded MFA as two-step login to simplify the nomenclature for our user base. And as we moved to Okta, then we just made MFA. That's just part of the login process. So we dropped the two steps. We don't use MFA or two steps. This is just how you log in today.
And can you talk a little bit more about how you rolled that out across the entire campus, correct?
Yes. So everyone who holds a NetID must use MFA, logging into any single sign-on service. And then we also are adding it to. Yeah, we are also adding MFA on to secure shell access as well as RDP access, where we didn't have that before. But we had it at the VPN level, and there are still some services where we can't integrate it directly, but we use Active's Radius agent where we can't utilize Okta Verify.
Got it. And that was actually going to be a follow-up question. What types of factors are you using with, does it vary across the campus? Is it kind of uniform? What's working well for Notre Dame?
So the most common use is to use Okta Verify. We do have users that don't want to use an app on their phone, and we've increased the use of U2F keys across campus. They've become popular, but those are for users that have their own device that they use regularly to log in with. But we allow voice calls, we allow SMS, text, Okta Verify.
Great. And for those who are less familiar with Okta Verify, it's an application that you can download on your phone, and you can use either a push notification, or there's a one-time PIN that you can use from there. And was that, I guess, talking a little bit more about maybe the response from campus, it was a pretty seamless rollout, it sounds like. The students got used to using MFA pretty quickly.
Yeah, so since we already had MFA on campus, the campus community was generally already familiar with the process. But I can say we did get comments when they had to enroll in Okta Verify. They found it as seamless and easier even in many circumstances than our previous vendor.
Got it. Great. Then, I'd love to dig a little bit more into some of the implementation pieces here for how this rolled out, because I know you guys had a pretty aggressive timeline to as a part of that cloud initiative and starting to roll out these different services. And I think one of the interesting pieces of context that I always think is powerful when you talk about education institutions is that you guys are doing all of this, with tight budgets. And we've seen that staffing, for example, and budget is from higher education CIOs some of the top issues that they face within their organizations. And so I guess I'd love to spend a little time with you hearing more about what that timeline looked like and how your team actually started to go and execute the rollout of this new solution for your campus.
So we did want to make this as seamless a transition for our user base as possible, and so we phased our approach, and the first phase we implemented this summer, and we're currently in the second phase. But that first phase was to implement single sign-on, what was in front of the user. We wanted to make sure we did that, and we did it over the summer to not coincide with any important academic events. But we had users, we wrote our own, with Okta Professional Services, our login activation page that actually deferred to Active Directory for the initial login and setting of the password in Okta, so that users didn't have to change their password. That was one of the key requirements that we had. And then we had an enrollment period where we made it available so users could enroll their devices and factors in Okta leading up to our cutover that we did in the summer. And then over the weekend, we were able to just switch a DNS record to point to Okta, and we were on our way. Users would just, the next time they went to log into a service, they were redirected to Okta and did their second factor and logged into their services. We integrated a few key services directly with Okta for our initial phase one cutover, and then we used a third party to act as a bridge for our CAS and SHIB apps that we wanted to give our developers a little more time to be able to convert and integrate directly with Okta. So we just integrated our ERP system, and Google is what we use for our email and collaboration, and then Salesforce and ServiceNow, and all these integrations took us minutes to do instead of hours or weeks.
That's great. And so you were using I know Okta has a number of pre-built integrations. Was that part of what helped with the timing there for you?
Yes, that's what the services that we chose to cut over were our most used services, and then they were a part of the Okta integration network with provisioners also.
Got it. Great. And I know we ended up chatting with you guys on actually it was the first day of school, right?
Yes.
When we had hopped on earlier this year. Tell me about that. What was day one? How was that different for you this time?
So actually we had many comments. We did our single sign-on cutover actually late July, and it was just pronounced as a non-event. So it was really seamless, and we had executives of the university even making those comments like, did it really happen? They didn't even notice. But then back to school, by then all of our constituencies had already enrolled in Okta. They already were using it, so the kind of help desk calls that we get were because people got new phones over the summer, and usual password reset issues that we normally have. But we weren't overburdened at all because we were on the phone with you guys.
Yeah, that's what we like to hear. So I guess, can you talk a little bit about what does this look like now? So you mentioned when we first started this conversation about what kind of the landscape looked like. What's the experience look like, maybe both now for your team, and also what would one of your end users see?
So, so now we're in this phase 2. So we're engaging with all of our developers to start transitioning their apps, changing their integration to point to Okta. So that's what we've been focused on. I don't know that I'm answering your question though.
I think I'd love to dig more in on that phase 2 piece and what you guys are looking ahead on. But when we started this conversation, you talked a bit about sort of the complexity of your landscape and the different applications and the different applications you're using to help manage groups and provisioning and that sort of thing. What does that look like now for your team? What's kind of the picture? Yeah.
Yeah. So we had all these disparate systems, and you had to go to each one of them to look at logs to be able to fix a particular data issue. It was hard to trace back to where the problem was, but now everything, our account lifecycle management, our single sign-on, our directory has all been converted to Okta Universal Directory and Okta Verify for MFA and single sign-on, and then we have the lifecycle also being managed within the Okta platform. So it's one interface. We were able to get read-only access to other constituents so they can actually see what's going on. So it's been a tremendous consolidation of services. We were able, I know, to eliminate about 160 different Amazon resources, including EC2 instances and load balancers and other resources in Amazon. So it has reduced our infrastructure footprint tremendously.
And I know that was something too, and I want to jump in on that. So you had mentioned all of the visibility and being able to reduce your on-premises footprint. I think something else that you had mentioned when we had last chatted too was that enhanced visibility as well. So what other, I think you mentioned that you had seen a number of logins outside of the U.S. as well, and the insight you could get there.
Yeah, so it was interesting. I mean, the day of cutover, within the first hour or so, we were just watching the login activity, and we saw, logins from 80 different countries, which was surprising at first, but then when we think about it, we have students all over the world, so it's just interesting. And really nobody having any access issues at all.
Well, that's great. And heading into what's next, and maybe we can, I know we had some time set here for lessons learned, maybe we can skip to sort of the what's next, and then we'll come back to this advice section. But what you mentioned, that phase 2 and sort of what the next phase is for you guys now that you have sort of consolidated many of your applications and much of your infrastructure and even been able to deprecate some of that on-premises footprint. What are you looking forward to? What's kind of the next wave here?
Yeah, so definitely migrating the rest of our applications to use Okta. We've already integrated several new services too since we cut over. We kind of were able to hold people at bay until we could get the infrastructure laid down. Now that we have a backlog of new services to integrate. We also we're doing in the middle of a proof of concept using the advanced server access product to add MFA to our secure shell access and also RDP access to some applications that need to be maintained on Windows infrastructure. And then we need to replace we have a guest access system that we have built, custom built, and so we would like to just integrate everything into Okta.
Right, so lots of extensions here. More applications, more different types of resources, and then extending it to different user types as well.
Yep.
Right. So I know I skipped over the slide, but we'll jump back here. One of the questions that we get often is, this. How do I start to, when you had walked through this journey, it sounded like a lot of this was grounded in the larger initiative around moving to the cloud. How did you start to build a business case around these different solutions for your organization?
So we did have the benefit of having this overarching strategy I talked about a little bit before about the cloud first strategy, and so having that that mantra coming from our enterprise architects and executive leadership was important. But we also had the executive vice president of the university would have units do an administrative unit review every 6 years or so, and so this was a time for us, for the IAM team particularly focused on doing the assessment of our team and how we did in our service delivery. And one of the key components out of that administrative unit review, which was done by internal parties and internal to the Office of Information Technologies, as well as other departments on campus, and then also from other universities. So our counterparts at other universities came in and did the assessment for us too. And one of the key findings out of there was always our time to service delivery. So it would take us too long in our customers' eyes to get new services off the ground, to integrate new services. And so that was a key finding in that administrative unit review. And so we were able to leverage that formal process of having that feedback to say we needed to do something. And so then it led us down evaluating several different service offerings, and then we did a extended proof of concept and evaluated like 20 key use cases. And we had our director actually involved in our proof of concept with Okta, and he was able to integrate 3 services like in a couple of minutes, and so he was really impressed with the speed and simplicity of having all of these applications already. Okta's already worked with all of these vendors to do the SAML integration and work out the kinks on your behalf, so you don't have to spend all these hours with the vendor on the phone trying to get a integration working. And then being able to evaluate what the true cost of these services. We were running all open source technologies. They're free, right? But they're not free. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had 9 staff members to support the infrastructure, and that's why our time to service delivery was so extended, because most of our time is spent in supporting the infrastructure and not doing the IAM work.
That's great. And so now your team, since you have simplified a lot of this, I mean, any other thoughts on what you're excited for next, and maybe identity specific, IAM specific, or just in general for your team?
Well, to really look at being able to define what those IAM policies are by role type at the university, to focus in on, if I assume this role at the university, I get this set of resources, and as I transition roles, those resources are revoked and appropriate resources are re-provisioned for whatever my new role is at the university. So being able to get finer grained in the access controls.
Great. And I have one more question for you, and then folks who are joining us, we do have, again, we'll jump into Q&A, open Q&A here in just a minute. So if you have any other questions, feel free to submit those. I do see a couple are already in here. But Michele, I guess any other lessons learned or things that maybe you wish you had known at the start of this process that you might want to share with your peers?
Just that even though we had an aggressive timeline, I think it was important to have a shorter time frame, just that this became the priority project for the entire organization, and that and you need it. You need everybody focused in to developers to convert all their apps, and we had to build a new data model for how we were sourcing the data from the ERP system, and just getting everybody's buy-in and getting excited about new way of working.
Great. And we will have some more details if folks are interested in getting more information. We'd be happy to follow up after. But Michele, thank you very much. I think there's a couple of questions that have been submitted here in the open Q&A. So there's one question about updating Active Directory with SQL using Okta. So that one, we actually have maybe a couple of follow-up questions to clarify. So for that person, we'll send you a follow-up note here so we can dig into that. And there's a question here about auditing access. And I think in general, I'll answer this more generally, and if there's maybe a follow-up question, we can certainly dig more into it separately. But when we think about auditing access and being able to provide insight into who has access to a specific application at a specific time, we do have Okta syslog can give you visibility into who has signed into which application at which specific time. So we do have ways to provide visibility into those logs if that's something that would be helpful for your organization. If there are specific compliance requirements or something that's driving that, we'd be happy to spend some more time with you to explore what those needs are and make sure that we would be able to accomplish those. Other questions that are jumping in here. It looks like, what tech stack are you using to get legacy SQL IAM data from on-prem into Okta APIs? I think these questions on some of these core ones we may need to follow up with you directly on, because I had been chatting with our folks who were talking about some of the Active Directory stuff separately. So let me follow up with you on that one as well. We do also, someone had said a separate one too on different applications and connections that are already pre-built into Okta. We do have a number of applications that are specific to the higher education space as well. So everything from Ellucian, if that's the system that you're using, to things like Blackboard, to, I know Michele mentioned using G Suite, but Office 365 as well. We do also have some insights into the applications that are most commonly used by the higher education organizations. So we have something called Businesses at Work, where you can break down the applications that are most commonly used by our higher education customers, the most popular and then also the fastest growing. So we'd be happy to send that around too if that would be interesting. And it looks like that might be all of our questions here.
I was just going to say, I could speak to the question about, I could say what we're using, the tech stack that we're using to interact with Okta.
Let's do it, yeah.
So here at Notre Dame, we've done a couple different things, but we tried to take the approach of the serverless where we could. So we are running .NET Core in a Lambda and making API calls from it. And we did that to interact with our account activation process and generating identifiers. We also use Python in some circumstances to call the APIs.
Great. Well, that's far better than me following up. Thank you, Michele.
And we also have, I was going to say, we also have a couple SCIM connectors that have been built in .NET as well.
Great. And I see that person followed up with a thanks. So it sounds like we're good to go on that one. Okay. Well, it looks like that might be the bulk of the questions here. If anyone else does have follow-ups, please feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to answer those. If you are also going to the EDUCAUSE event later this month, it's coming up quickly. We'll have some folks who are going to be on site, so if you have questions, feel free to swing by the booth. We'd also be happy to give you a demo and show you what this looks like in action. So there's some details here, but you can also feel free to find us on the event floor. We'd love to meet you all. And with that, I think that sums everything up. So Michele, thank you so much again for taking the time to chat with us today. We really appreciate your going through this.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you.